There are certainly a lot of good ideas to debate about, but not every good debatable idea is suitable for the British parliamentary format. This is because for a motion to truly be fair, it must be fair to all teams, especially those in closing. And in my experience, the easiest technique to ensure proper depth and accessibility is to think about how the debate would play out for closing government, which is arguably the most disadvantaged team in BP debating, precisely because of motion construction that is too superficial. So for this video, let's use the example of the motion, "This House supports the decline of traditional television." Of course, this is a very broad and seemingly superficial motion, but as we will see, often simple, clear motions are very good testing grounds for deep debates. There are three specific aspects, then, to note when we are actively thinking about closing government during this process. First, test through the most intuitive clashes of the debate. Don't just have labels for the arguments here. Make sure to be disciplined in explaining at least two main components of each argument. For example, one intuitive clash in this debate would be on whether the rise of streaming platforms as a replacement to traditional television is good or bad. Opening government could say that streaming platforms provide more freedom and competition, more options, which is good for consumers so that they can feel that they have more autonomy to choose what they want to watch, as opposed to being constrained by few traditional television sources. On the other hand, opening opposition could simply explain that the rise of streaming platforms is bad because it is relatively more expensive due to subscription costs, and it is relatively more gatekept due to exclusive streaming rights. And they could argue that this level of accessibility is more important of a consideration than opening government's perception of the freedom of choice. Second, now that you have established a quite decent core basic intuitive clash, ask yourself first, if you were closing government, is it possible to run any big brain novel extension that could quite demonstrably allow you to have a reasonably high chance of winning? Again, I'm not saying here that it has to be an extremely high risk extension, because it's not accessible, but that it is a reasonably meaningful issue that if the opening did not sufficiently cover, it gives good odds to closing teams. So for this motion, that issue would likely be on whether the decline of traditional television improved political discourse or not, as it is possible to argue that traditional television has historically been used as state propaganda by states, whereas its decline promoted the breaking up of these previous echo chambers. So this is an entirely different issue compared to the entertainment and costs that were argued by the opening half. And so if closing government chooses to focus solely on this issue, it would actually stand a very good chance. So even if closing government doesn't tackle the entertainment and cost issue in the debate, the political discourse alone can be weighed to be more important. So at this point, it's necessary for me to highlight that you have to have this pathway while you are constructing a motion, because you don't want to have a big brain extension that is too big brain or too excessively far off. Otherwise, no one is really going to get it at all. And at the same time, you don't want to have a motion that is too superficial with only one issue to tackle with no possible horizontal extension. Because if that were the case, it's very, very difficult for closing half to make a meaningful argument otherwise. Third, if you were closing government, is there a way to deepen the opening government's arguments that were presented without having to rely too significantly on existing mechanisms? What would be the cleanest vertical extension? What details would help specifically? For this motion, if opening government spent a significant amount of time proving that the decline of traditional television ushered in the rise of streaming services and they explained that this led to more options, then one intuitive vertical extension would be to spend a lot of time talking about the process of this decline further, such as how it coincided with the rise of social media and data extraction on a very, very large scale, so that streaming platforms could create algorithms that aligned with one's preferences more than the preset programming of traditional television channels. So again, this is the same argument of options and preferences of opening government, but it's vastly specified through a quite accessible mechanism on algorithms and targeted advertising. So the point of this exercise is that you want a relatively accessible set of deeper mechanisms that come from teams spending a little bit more time on characterizations that opening government can quite easily overlook. So one final note that I'm going to say here for this video. Admittedly, a lot of these tips help when thinking about closing opposition as well. But the main reason as to why I think closing government is more so disadvantaged is that they have less time than closing opposition, and specifically less response time against closing opposition too. Which is why in the way the format is designed, it is often likely the case that closing government's zone of potential extension possibilities often will either make it or break it for them. So that's the most important consideration when you are making motions. Remember, thinking about closing government doesn't mean that you need to intentionally leave room for a silver bullet argument for them. It doesn't mean that we should overcorrect and make it too easy for closing government. Instead, thinking about closing government is a healthy practice to balance out being so committed to one's initial arguments to certain motions. And so I hope if you set motions one day, you don't forget all the closing government teams before you that have endured for far too long in the shadows to be neglected and abandoned by yet another team and another AdCore. Alright, that's it for today's video. Thanks and have a great day.